instructions to make sure I push the button and turn down the microphone. So, I got a thumbs up back there. Okay, awesome. Very good. This is Palm Sunday. It's a pretty traditional Sunday for all of us. We've got the classic Palm Sunday text. Jesus coming into Jerusalem with the palm branches and the donkey. We are so very familiar with this story. We all know it by heart. It's an important day, and it's a day that usually I think we look at as a very glamorous sort of celebratory day, right? It's a happy day. It's a good day where the king is arriving in Jerusalem. But you know, the truth of it is, I'm sure that from Jesus' perspective, there's a lot more going on in his mind. And this is not necessarily the triumphal entry to him that it is to us, because he knows exactly what he's headed to. Next slide. This for Jesus is a combat mission. He's going into combat with the forces of evil. The forces of evil, sin, Satan, and our own sinful nature have overcome us. They've overcome the Jewish people. We are trapped and mired in sin in this world we live in. And so he is entering Jerusalem not just as the triumphant king, but he's entering Jerusalem to do combat with the forces of evil, which will end with his death on Good Friday. Next slide. And it all starts with the taking of the colt, right? We've almost got two stories here, and at first appearance they may seem like they're not really linked together. You could preach on the taking of the colt, you could preach on the triumphal entry separate from that, but there is a linkage between these two. And I was telling Pastor Dan we should have probably printed this one out for the children so they could be coloring as we're doing the sermon here. That's the best we could do on that picture. But there are two messages, yet they're woven into one message. So let's look at the taking of the colt first. Oftentimes we see a lot of different things going on in the story about when the disciples go and get the colt, the foal, the donkey, unbroken, never been saddled before for Jesus to ride on. Oftentimes we look at it and we focus on the fact that it was unrideable and the fact that a person could get on for the first time and not be thrown off. And we look at Jesus' lordship in this whole thing. And certainly that's going on. Sometimes we look at the disciples and they walk up there and they don't say a word. And it offends our American sensibilities because they just grab the colt and start to go. Why didn't they say something up front? Why didn't they go and approach the people who were standing nearby and do something before they began to untie the colt? They were so socially indiscreet and insensitive as to not at least explain themselves. Maybe that thought goes through our minds. I don't know. But if we focus on those two things, we miss the bigger picture. Not that those two things couldn't have some truth to them. The first thing we miss is that this is a proclamation of who Jesus really is. He is true man, but he is also true God, incarnate. He is 100% God. He is deity. And the fact that he knew that donkey, that foal, that colt of a donkey was going to be there at that time for him to use, and he knew that if the disciples proclaimed certain words to them, when they questioned the disciples, they would let them take it. That shows his divine knowledge, his divine wisdom. We also miss some deeper symbolism here. And to understand why Jesus rode on a colt, an unbroken animal, you have to go back very briefly to the Old Testament. You have to go back, first of all, to examples like the two unyoked milk cows that the Philistines used to return the Ark of the Covenant to the Jewish people back in the Old Testament. They had taken it during combat, they kept it for a while. God had inflicted plagues on the Philistines. They were tired of the plagues, and so now they picked these two, never been yoked, never been used to plow a field, never been used to pull a cart before, these two milk cows, and they yoked them, put the Ark of the Covenant on, and sent it back to Israel. There's symbolism there. But probably a better bit of symbolism is the fact that there was another custom, another requirement by God. If a person was killed in the Old Testament and his killer was unknown, the nearest village or town was required to offer a sacrifice for him to God, a sin offering. And they had to have a red heifer who had never been, guess what? Never been used to pull a plow, never been used to pull a cart. An unyoked red heifer had to be sacrificed on behalf of this dead man whose killer was unknown, to atone for the sin that had been committed. And so as we look at that, I think that probably is the bigger thing to look at. The fact that Jesus picked a colt, an unbroken animal, refers to the fact that he is the sin offering for the sins of the world. Also, it is fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, as we saw in our Old Testament lesson. It's almost like the network security key, if you will, that God puts in there to make sure we get it right and understand that this is what had to happen, and this is the right person to do it. He is the Messiah. And you know, it's also an act of faith on the part of the owner of the colt, is it not? The owner of the colt gave up the colt to the disciples because he realized something. He realized it was the Lord's colt in the first place, and he was a steward of that colt. He didn't really own that colt. He was given stewardship of it. This brings us to the issue of stewardship here. This is not Stewardship Sunday, I got that. But it reminds me of a story about a businessman who was running a rather unsuccessful business. He had ran it for years, he had been frustrated, he had dwelled on it, it had kept him up at night, he had done all sorts of things to improve his business. Nothing seemed to work. Finally, he went to church one Sunday and heard the pastor preach about how we have to give all things to the Lord, because everything we have, ultimately, we are only stewards of. And so as he left church that Sunday, he gave it up to the Lord. He said, Lord, this is not my business, it is your business. Take it and do with it as you please. Well, later on that evening, he received a phone call, and they told him his business was burning. And so he went to the site of the fire, and he stood next to the fire, next to the building, and he watched it, and he was very calm. He was very placid, if you will. And there was almost a smile on his face as he watched his building burn. One of his co-workers, his colleagues, ran up next to him and saw how he was taking it, and he expected him to be all upset about the burning of his business. And he said, don't you know what's going on here? That's your business burning down. How can you be so calm about it? His response to that was, let it burn. It's God's business, and if he wants to take it, it's up to him. He finally understood his stewardship of the business God had given him. We're all stewards here. We're stewards of everything in our lives. We're stewards of ourselves, of our bodies. We're stewards of our time, our possessions. We're stewards of our children. We're stewards of the job God has given us. We're all stewards. This church, which I've been a member of probably since I was 2 years old, is a steward of everything God has given you. You're only a steward. We're only a steward of the building, of the programs. But most importantly, what's been entrusted to us as a church, along with the entire invisible church of God on earth, is we are stewards of the gospel and the Great Commission. That is the biggest and most important stewardship we have. How about it? If the church began to burn tonight, how would we react? If our house began to burn tonight, how would we react? I know when we first went to Sierra Leone, West Africa, we had to look at the situation carefully, because in the 4 years prior to that, 2 missionaries from our mission alone, Lutheran Bible translators, had lost children on the mission field. That caused us to ask quite a few questions. Not only had they lost 2 children, they had lost a pilot who crashed, they lost another missionary translator out on the coast who had a heart attack. We had to look at that, and we had to remind ourselves, we are not stewards of our own bodies and time in this earth. We are stewards. We are stewards of our children. And that thought went through our heads. As Jesus Christ enters, he comes as the sacrifice for sin. Let's see what we got next year. He comes as the sacrifice for sin. And this reminds me of another story. It's a story that took place in Sierra Leone back in about 1993. That's the American ambassador up there, Mrs. Peters. That's her security manager to her left, Jim. And that's some of us, and you can see I probably look a little bit different there. No hiding that. The children are a little smaller. They're all adults now. But there's a story that goes with this trip. I was the volunteer warden for the north part of the country. And this was after we had the military coup, after we'd been evacuated and returned. And I was assigned to duties on a volunteer basis to monitor the situation in the northern part of the country. But also, she had the custom of traveling to different parts of the country to visit. And I will tell you that for the people in Kabbalah in the far north, this is probably the most important visitor they would ever receive in their lifetime, was the American ambassador. And so I made all the arrangements. I made her appointments. I found a place for her to stay. And when the day came for her to arrive, I drove down to the military checkpoint on the south part of town, and there she was waiting with her caravan. And we had a military post there, a Sierra Leone Army military post in town. We also had a district officer, the highest ranking civilian official, who were both supposed to meet her there. Well, the district officer wasn't there yet, but the military commander, a major of the military post, was. And so I pulled around to the back of the caravan, and he proudly pulled around to the front of the caravan in his Jeep donated by America. And we took off heading toward town. And it was a great time. And guess what? They had the Boy Scouts out there. The Boy Scouts were out there saluting us. I had no idea they had Boy Scouts in Kabbalah in northern Sierra Leone. And they had white rocks alongside the road about every 20 feet. They had taken these rocks and placed them and painted them. And there were people out there waving, and it was a grand reception. And about 300 yards down the road, the major's Jeep broke down. It took about 5 minutes. I think he was trying to restart it, but he could not get it restarted. And so he ran around to the back of the convoy, jumped in the passenger side next to me. He commandeered my vehicle, and he said, "You lead them in." And so we drove around to the front, and we began with the caravan again, heading toward town. Well, about another 300 or 400 yards down the road, the district officer, who was late, goes flying past us heading south. He turns around. He goes flying past us again. He takes the lead in front of me and in front of the major and begins to lead us into town. Well, his office was in one part of town. The military post was in the other part of town, and there was a Y. So he's proudly leading us towards his office. He takes the left branch. We take the right branch. And I'm sure he probably figured out shortly thereafter there was nobody behind him. It was kind of like a scene out of the Keystone Cops, folks. It was, I won't say it was funny, but I guess maybe to me it was. But you know, pride took a blow that day. First, the major, whose Jeep broke down, and he had to rely upon an American civilian's land commissioner lead. And then the district officer, who assumed he was the most important person in town, and the ambassador was going to follow him. And there was all this pomp and circumstance, and them trying to put on a good front, but it just didn't really pull off the way they wanted it to. That is so different from what we see happening in our text for today. Jesus enters humbly on a donkey. There's pomp and circumstance, but it's not anything he calls for or puts on. He enters humbly on a colt, the foal of a donkey. It's so totally opposite of what we tend to do in life, folks. We get involved in the pomp and circumstance of life. We get involved in the displays and the pride issues. Jesus doesn't do that. He enters humbly into Jerusalem to face his death. The good news is that on Palm Sunday, he does choose to humble himself and enter Jerusalem in a totally different way than the world leaders and the celebrities do in our times. He entered not on a white steed. He entered not on a chariot that is used by kings. He didn't enter on a Cadillac convertible sitting back up on the back deck there with the roof down. He entered on a donkey. This doesn't fit the picture of a worldly king that the Jews want, and probably sometimes the picture we'd like to have of our kings. Listen to these verses from Corinthians. "For ye see your calling, brethren, how not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world and things which are despised hath God chosen, yes, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence." You see, folks, what we look for in a king depends on what we look for in life. If it's easy street, if it's the ways of the world, if it's honor, if it's status, if it's pride, we'll never understand Christ and the crucifixion. It will always seem like an exhibition of weakness to us. We will also never understand why God allows our pride to be challenged so often. How many times have you had issues with pride? I know I have. And you say to yourself, God, I thought I learned that lesson. And you say, no.